Then, just as she turned to leave, she heard her name. Firm. Authoritative. She froze. Looking up, she saw the captain standing beside the man she had ignored, the very man she had spilled food on without a second thought. Except now, he wasn't just another passenger. He reached into his jacket, pulling out an ID badge, and in that moment, the color drained from her face. The murmurs of other passengers grew louder. She had unknowingly mistreated someone important, but the worst part, she still didn't know just how deep her mistake ran. The stewardess felt her heart pound as she stared at the ID badge in the man's hand. The airline's logo was unmistakable, and beneath it, his name was printed in bold letters. Passengers around them whispered, their curiosity turning into realization. He wasn't just an ordinary traveler. He was a high-ranking executive with the airline, the very company she worked for. Her breath caught as the captain cleared his throat. "I believe you owe this gentleman an apology," he said, his tone firm but controlled. The stewardess swallowed hard, her earlier arrogance crumbling. She forced a smile, but it was too late. The damage had been done. I didn't mean," she stammered, but the executive simply raised a hand, silencing her. "This isn't about an apology," he said calmly. "It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching." And then the final blow, he turned to the captain and handed him a folder. "I've been reviewing service reports," he continued. "Unfortunately, this isn't the first complaint. Effective immediately, she won't be on the next flight." The stewardess felt the floor drop beneath her. This wasn't just a warning, it was a reckoning. As she stood frozen in shock, passengers exchanged knowing glances. The man who had sat quietly in his stained suit had just given her a lesson she'd never forget. Karma had arrived, and this time it had a name. The stewardess stood in stunned silence as the passengers slowly gathered their things, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. She had spent the entire flight dismissing and belittling someone she thought didn't matter, only to learn he had the power to change everything. Her confidence had vanished, replaced by regret, but there was nothing she could do now. The executive gave a small nod to the captain before walking toward the exit. As he passed, a few passengers offered him approving smiles, silently acknowledging the justice they had just witnessed. He didn't gloat, didn't look back. He simply adjusted his suit and stepped off the plane, dignity intact. As the stewardess finally moved, her steps felt heavier than before. This flight had ended, but for her, the real journey was just beginning. Because lessons like this don't fade, they stay with you, reminding you that respect should never be optional. Flying should be a smooth experience, but for one man on this flight, things took a humiliating turn. It all started when a stewardess, careless and dismissive, spilled food all over a well-dressed black passenger. Instead of apologizing, she smirked, brushing it off as if it didn't matter. Other passengers noticed, some whispering, others shaking their heads, but no one spoke up. The man, calm but clearly frustrated, wiped at the mess on his clothes, his dignity bruised more than his suit. But what no one knew was that this flight wasn't over, not just in miles but in karma. Because when they finally landed, the stewardess was about to get a shocking surprise she never saw coming. Something that would turn the tables in a way no one expected. Stay tuned to see how fate delivered a lesson she'd never forget. The tension lingered in the air as the plane continued its journey. The man, still dabbing at the stain on his suit, took a deep breath, choosing not to argue. His composure only seemed to amuse the stewardess, who walked away without a second glance. A few passengers exchanged uneasy looks, but no one dared to intervene. The flight carried on as usual, announcements, drink service, quiet conversations. But there was an unshakable feeling that this moment wasn't over. Who was this man? His presence alone commanded respect, yet he remained silent, his eyes focused out the window as if deep in thought. The stewardess, meanwhile, carried herself with an air of arrogance, laughing with a coworker as if nothing had happened. She had no idea that fate was already working behind the scenes. With every passing minute, the landing drew closer, and so did the unexpected twist waiting for her. As the flight carried on, the stewardess continued her rounds, smiling politely at some passengers while barely acknowledging others. It was clear she treated people differently, choosing who deserved her kindness and who didn't. The man she had spilled food on remained calm, but the way he carried himself, his quiet confidence, the way he adjusted his suit despite the mess, hinted that he was no ordinary traveler. He glanced at his watch, as if counting down to something, though no one could guess what. A few rows behind him, an older woman who had seen the whole thing shook her head in disbelief. She had wanted to say something, but like the others, she hesitated. What could she do now? The stewardess had already moved on, her laughter filling the cabin as she joked with another crew member. She seemed untouchable, certain there would be no consequences. But what she didn't realize was that life has a way of correcting its own mistakes, and hers was about to catch up with her. The plane began its descent, and the stewardess walked down the aisle one last time, checking that seatbelts were fastened. She barely glanced at the man she had spilled food on, acting as if he didn't exist. But as she reached the front of the cabin, she noticed something unusual. The captain had stepped out of the cockpit and was speaking quietly with another crew member, his expression serious. Passengers began to take notice, sensing that something was different. The man in the stained suit remained still, but there was a shift in the air around him. A few people stole glances in his direction, as if realizing they had underestimated him. The stewardess, however, was too caught up in her own world to notice. She straightened her uniform, preparing for landing, completely unaware that the moment she stepped off this plane, everything was about to change. Karma was waiting at the gate, and it was closer than she thought. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, a nervous energy filled the cabin. The captain, now standing near the exit, exchanged glances with the flight attendants, his expression unreadable. Passengers gathered their belongings, the usual rustling of bags and quiet chatter filling the air, but something felt different. The stewardess, still oblivious, adjusted her uniform and prepared to disembark, eager to put this flight behind her.